Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. I'm thankful to the Management Association of Pakistan for giving me this opportunity to talk about Pakistan's economy. So we'll start with the present status of the economy, the reasons why we might be lagging behind other countries, the growing challenges, risks that the country faces, and then lessons and recommendations. So the methodology that I'm using is that I'm comparing Pakistan with other countries in the region and the world to diagnose where we stand versus the rest. The comparable universe are all countries with a population of over 1 million and GDP of over 10 billion. There are 149 countries that qualify for this universe. Pakistan's population is over 200 million and GDP is over 270 billion. So basically, it's way above the universe. And we are using 2020 as the base because that's the year where all the data was available. For 2021, the data was not available. So the present status, one of the key indicators of United Nations is Human Development Report or Human Development Index. Pakistan is 118 out of these 149 countries. Bangladesh is 103 and India is 101. And basically, Human Development Index is based on a long and healthy life, knowledge or education, and a decent standard of living. So we obviously don't do too well versus the universe. Life expectancy in Pakistan is somewhat in line with India and Bangladesh. Our expected years of schooling, unfortunately, only 9 years of schooling versus 11 in Bangladesh and 12 in India. And our ranking is 143 out of 149 countries. If you see the countries below us, these are Mauritania, Tanzania, Sudan, Mali, Chad, and Niger. So you can see that in terms of education, where do we stand? Only 8 countries in the global universe that are below us. Adult literacy, again, in Bangladesh and India have 74% literacy. We are at 57%. And again, if you look at the countries which are below us in terms of adult literacy, Mauritania, Ethiopia, Senegal, Gambia, Afghanistan, so not a good company that we're keeping. If we look at the youth literacy rate, it's 75% in Pakistan versus 92% in Bangladesh and 93% in India. Again, we are lacking in terms of per capita income in 2020. In Pakistan, the per capita income was about $1,200. In Bangladesh, close to $2,000, and in India, close to $1,900. So again, unfortunately, lagging behind our regional competitors. Primary school enrollment is decent at 95%. Bangladesh is 120. Now you would say, how can one have 120% primary school enrollment? Because even the adults are going back to school. And that's why it's over 100%. When it comes to secondary school enrollment, we are way below. 45% of children are enrolled in secondary schools in Pakistan versus 74% in Bangladesh and 75% in India. And if you look at the post-secondary school enrollment, it's 12% in Pakistan versus 23% in Bangladesh and 29% in India. The secondary school enrollment dropped significantly as there's a shortage of schools at the secondary school level. And so once children complete their primary school, there is no school close by where they can go for secondary school. And therefore, we see this huge drop coming in. If we see university or equivalent enrollment in India, 1 out of 3 youths are enrolled. In Bangladesh, 1 out of 4 youths are enrolled. And in Pakistan, 1 out of 8 youths are enrolled. So we need to do a lot of catching up in this area. If you look at the freedom index, human freedom index, we are somewhat in line with Bangladesh. India is slightly better. Press freedom, again, not a significant difference between the 3 countries. Economic freedom, we are way behind. And if you see how economic freedom has been defined, this is basically based on heritage organization. It's based on trade freedom, tax burden, and judicial effectiveness. So we're lagging behind other countries here. and that's impacting obviously the business environment. So the reason why we are lagging, in my view, basically we are not spending enough on human and physical development, and B, whatever is spent is not spent effectively. So both of these combined cause an issue. So in order to grow the economy, there are certain inputs that are needed. Healthcare, because our productive citizens add to the economy. Population planning is very important to control, obviously, the population and the better resource management. Education and training, science and technology, agriculture, industry, infrastructure, political stability, governance, law and order, and a dominant private sector. These are all inputs that are important for the economy to grow. If you look at India before 1991, they had a lot of these factors going good for them, except for a dominant private sector. India was based on a socialist economy model of Soviet Union, and it was lagging behind economically. In 1991, when Dr. Manmohan Singh came in, they opened the markets, they cut the bureaucracy, and since then, India has really taken up off in terms of economic growth rate. Obviously, as the economy grows, the per capita income goes up, exports grow, we have more that we can spare to spend on the military, and human development we can spend more. So these are the inputs which are very important for the economy to grow, and these are the inputs that have been mostly lagging as we have seen it in terms of education and so on. Now again, we look at the worldwide governance indicators of the World Bank. In voice and accountability, we and Bangladesh are close by. India is much better off. This is basically people having a voice and government being accountable. So we are not, we don't do too well here. 41 out of 149 countries. Political stability and absence of violence. We are 9 out of 149 countries. Bangladesh is 31 and India is 33. And political stability and absence of violence is defined as, by World Bank, as the likelihood of political instability and or politically motivated violence, including terrorism. So there are only 8 countries in our universe that are below us, and they are Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Mali, and Syria. So this is one of the reasons that we only get less than $2 billion in foreign direct investment, because our perception in terms of political stability, law and order, absence of violence is not too good. And we need to work on that. And I think the Afghan war, 2 wars that we fought, has a lot to do with this one factor. Regulatory quality, we are doing reasonably well versus our neighbors. Rule of law, we are below Bangladesh and India. Control of corruption against, we are below Bangladesh and India. So the reasons of poor governance standards is lack of evolution of a democratic process. There were too much interruptions in the democratic process. Political instability, inconsistency in government policies, impact of terrorism and violence, failure to decentralize and delegate financial and administrative powers at the local level. This has been done worldwide now, that powers are allocated at the local level. It took us a good 65 years to delegate powers from the federal to the provincial level under the 18th Amendment. And since the last 12 years, there has been no further delegation down to the local level. This is important because a common man, we are on a mahalla system. So if I'm living in a mahalla और मेरे महल्ले में dispensary में दवाई नहीं है, या फिर एक स्कूल में टीचर नहीं है जहाँ मेरे बच्चे जाते हैं, या सड़क ख़राब है, तो जो लोकल काउंसलर है उसको तो मैं पकड़ सकता हूँ जाके, बिकॉज वो वहीं रहता है और उसको फिर अगला इलेक्शन भी लड़ना है, उसको मेरा वोट भी चाहिए. मगर जो एक ब्यूरोक्रेट बैठा हुआ इस्लामाबाद में या कराची सेक्रेटेरिएट में, उस तक कॉमन मैन का एक्सेस नहीं है. So we need to delegate the financial and administrative powers down to the local level, because from India to Turkey to US, everybody has done that, and this has played a key role in improving governance. We have a centralized and inefficient bureaucracy. There's lack of accountability and merit, lack of competency at the government level, and insufficient funding to government bodies such as local governments, judiciary, and police to play their effective role. So if you look at education spending as a percentage of economy, Pakistan has spent about 2% of GDP. Bangladesh has spent about 2%, and India has spent about 3% of their GDP on education. So over the last 21 years, Pakistan has spent $36 billion less on education as a percentage of economy versus India. In other words, if we had spent 3% of GDP, we would have spent 36 billion more on education versus what we did, because we're spending 2% of GDP. As compared to Bangladesh, actually, we have spent about $6 billion more. So this is, and you see that Bangladesh education outcomes are much better than Pakistan, as we just saw earlier. So it's a question of both investment and governance. So Bangladesh also spent 2% of GDP on education like we did, but their education outcomes are much better than us. Obviously, India spent 50% more than both Pakistan and Bangladesh. If you look at healthcare spending, Bangladesh has spent 4 times. They have spent 2.5% of GDP on healthcare. We have spent 0.7, and even India spent twice as much as us. So over the last 21 years, Pakistan has spent $22 billion less on healthcare as a percentage of economy versus India, and $69 billion less than Bangladesh. So imagine if we had spent another $20-30 billion on education, on basically healthcare of the people, what improvements in terms of economic productivity it would have brought in. Similarly, if you look at science and technology, Pakistan has spent 0.03% of the GDP on science and technology over the last 12 years. Bangladesh has spent 0.22, so about 7 times us, and India has spent 0.16% of GDP, so about 5 times us. So over the last 12 years, Pakistan has spent $4 billion less on science and technology as a percentage of economy versus India, and $7 billion less than Bangladesh on science and technology. If we come to agriculture, Pakistan has spent 0.15% of GDP on average over the last 12 years. Bangladesh has spent 1%, so it has spent about 7 times what Pakistan has spent on agriculture. And India has spent 10 times what Pakistan has spent on agriculture. So if over the last 12 years, Pakistan had spent the same percentage of GDP on agriculture as India, we would have spent $42 billion more. And if we had spent the same as Bangladesh, we would have spent another 26. So imagine another $30-40 billion if we had spent on agriculture. It would have brought an agriculture revolution. And this is what we see, that, Punjab, you just cross the border towards India and the productivity doubles or triples. And this is the result of that investment in agriculture that India has made, and unfortunately, we have not. And the outcome then, you can see that, in terms of cotton crop, we started at 10 million in 2000, and today we are at around 8 million. And India started at about the same 10-12 million cotton bales, and today they are at 36 million. Even in terms of other crops, obviously we have not done as well as we could have if we had spent more on agriculture and science and technology. Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, in terms of export to GDP ratio, were about the same, about 12%, 13% 20 years ago. Today, we are down to 10%. Bangladesh is 12%, and India is 19% of GDP. So our exports have not grown. And if you look at the countries which are ranked below Pakistan in terms of export to GDP ratio, they are Kenya, Nigeria, Cuba, Gambia, Haiti, Ethiopia, Nepal, Yemen, Burundi, Afghanistan, and Sudan. So we can do a lot better in terms of exports. I think, again, if you look at population planning in India and Bangladesh, population has grown at 1.9% per year. In Pakistan, it has grown by 2.7% per year. So if we had grown at the same rate as India and Bangladesh, over the, our population, I'm talking over the last 50 years, if we had grown at the same rate as India and Bangladesh, which is about 1.8% versus 2.7%, our population would have been 15 crore rather than 22 crore today. 7 crore less people. and our per capita income would have been 1700 rather than 1200, just because you have less of population, uh, you have the per capita. So again, we have not focused on population planning, and this is just one factor that if we had grown by about 2% rather than 2.7%, makes a huge difference in terms of per capita, in terms of the amount of population that we are now managing. Military spending, Pakistan has spent about 3.7% of GDP on military. Bangladesh has spent 1.2% of GDP over the last 21 years or so, and India 2.6% of GDP. So Pakistan is ranked 9 out of 149 countries in terms of how much we spend on the military. And Pakistan has spent $39 billion more on military as a percentage of economy versus India over the last 21 years. And Pakistan has spent $92 billion more on military as a percentage of economy versus Bangladesh over the last 21 years. Again, you see, if you look at a comparison of India and Pakistan in terms of military spending, in 2000, Pakistan was spending $3 billion on military spending, and India was spending $14 billion. So about 5 times. If you see today, after 21 years, we are spending $10 billion and India is spending $73 billion, which is 7 times. So you can see that this gap is increasing. And this gap is not increasing because India is spending a higher percentage of their economy or budget on the military. This gap is increasing because India's economy is growing a lot faster than us. So if we want to grow our military spending, the best way is that we need to focus on growth of economy. This is our only way that we'll be able to somehow grow our military spending. So cost of bureaucracy, state-owned enterprises, the total debt is about 2 trillion rupees, which is about $11 billion. And the government is spending about 1.1 trillion rupees, which is $6 billion per year on the grants and subsidies of the state-owned enterprises. And this 1.1 trillion is 23% of our tax revenues, which we are just spending to sustain these state-owned enterprises, which we should have prioritized a long time ago. And we go to IMF for a $6 billion package, and we end up agreeing to all these type of conditions, and we are just basically spending the same $6 billion in subsidies and grants to state-owned enterprises in 1 year. How much we basically are going to IMF for that $6 billion package. Sorry, I need to come. The other element is, there was a recent Islamabad High Court judgment where the government was allocating 4 sectors in Islamabad to the government officials and basically, the judiciary officials. And Islamabad High Court estimated the value of this land that was being allocated to government officials at 1 trillion rupees, which is $5.5 billion. Okay, this is just for one scheme in Islamabad in 1 year. Obviously, provincial governments have their own schemes as well. And if you look at the last 75 years, you can just imagine how much money, that money which should have gone to agriculture, population planning, education, healthcare, have actually gone here. And the cost of that is phenomenal. It's $5.5 billion just for these 4 sectors of Islamabad, as estimated by the Islamabad High Court. Then another key issue we are facing, that the actuarial deficit. Pakistan government employees' pensions are not funded, and the estimate of that is around 25 trillion rupees of government pensions, which remain unfunded. Which is equivalent to 44% of our GDP. So our debt to GDP ratio is 100%, but obviously it does not include these unfunded liabilities, which are government pensions. It obviously does not also include the overall corruption. So there's a lot of waste in the economy that needs to be addressed, so we can focus more on the productive areas. Government revenues to tax collection, Pakistan has collected about 14% of its GDP in taxes. Bangladesh's tax collection is 10% of their economy, whereas India has tax collection is 19% of their economy. In terms of federal tax collection, all three countries are about 10% of GDP, but India has done a much better job in terms of provincial tax collection. So over the last 21 years, Pakistan has collected about $200 billion less in taxes versus India and 144 billion more in taxes than Bangladesh. So in Bangladesh, tax collection has been lower than Pakistan, but still they've done a better job by controlling their expenses. In India, tax collection has been higher than Pakistan, but most of the tax has gone into productive sectors. Again, in terms of corruption, actually Bangladesh is ranked worse than Pakistan in terms of corruption. But despite of that, they are doing better. But again, does not mean that we should not control corruption. But the point is that there are other factors beside corruption, such as spending on productive factors, which makes a key difference, and we need to focus on that. So if you look at the growth of our nominal growth of GDP, in 1972, Pakistan's GDP was 9 trillion. Today is 9 billion. Today is 264 billion. So it has grown 29 times. Bangladesh economy has grown in the same time period by 54 times, India by 37 times, and Malaysia and Indonesia by 140 times. So again, I think if we had spent a bit more on productive factors, we could have grown as well as Bangladesh or even Malaysia and Indonesia. Education, again, is a very key factor. I don't have too much time to go into detail, but basically, 23 million children are not going to school, and about 18 million children going to government schools are getting a very poor quality of education. Again, if you look at one study done by Boston Consulting Group, it says that investment in education is the single most crucial factor in developing economic growth, in driving economic growth. There was a study done which shows that 1 year increase in secondary education for the entire workforce, the GDP of Pakistan can grow by 13% or $40 billion. So the average education in Pakistan is 5 years for an average citizen. If you can take it from 5 years to 6 years, our economy can grow by $40 billion. Then if you can take it from 6 years to 7 years, our economy can grow by another $40 billion. So education is one factor where we need to focus more. So our per capita income was pretty much in line, but the last 15, 20 years versus India and Bangladesh, it has come down significantly. Again, I highlight that it's important that we focus on productive factors to grow the economy. Economic risk indicators, if you look at our debt to GDP ratio, it has grown from 63% to about 100% over the last few years. If you look at total debt to GDP ratio, India and Pakistan are about the same, about 88%, 89%. Bangladesh is 39%. If you look at external debt to GDP, the last few years, it has grown to 43%, and you can see the steep rise, which obviously has increased our risk, economic risk. And if you look at external debt to exports, our external debt is 5 times export, whereas for India and Bangladesh, it is about 1 times, about the same as exports. So again, a high risk factor for us is the external debt. Interest payment to GDP, Pakistan spends about 6.3% of GDP on interest. India spends 3% and Bangladesh 2.3%. Why Pakistan spends more? Because Pakistan's policy rate is about 10%. And in India and Bangladesh, it is about 4 to 5%. So that's why we end up spending more. Foreign exchange reserves to economy, again, you see that we are only at 6%, Bangladesh is 13%, and India is at 21%. And then if you look at basically last few years, you see that our interest payment as a percentage of tax revenues have gone up to 55%. And if you see what has happened, that the development spending, which is the green line, you see it's coming down from about 50% to 26%. So as our interest payments have gone up, our development spending has gone down, and that is obviously risky for us because without development spending, our economy cannot sustain or grow at a very high rate. So some of the lessons learned from all of this, basically recently, the national security policy of Pakistan was approved by the top political and military leadership of Pakistan. And some of the excerpts I've highlighted here, it says, realizing the symbiotic relationship between economic, human, and traditional security is now imperative for Pakistan's long-term development. So there is an appreciation and realization at the top level that human security, economic security is as important as military security, and that's a very good development. Then it says keep economic security at the core, and judiciously transfer the dividends of a strong economy to further strengthen our defense and human security. So again, key focus is now on economy. A country is as secure as its most vulnerable citizen. The safety, security, dignity, and prosperity of a citizen in all manifestations will remain the ultimate purpose of Pakistan national security. So again, now we talk about national security means focusing on the security of a common man. This is what it says. And as you know, the common man has been agroed for a good 75 years. So good to see that the focus is now turning to a common man. Good governance, it talks about, which we have done that. So basically, I think this vision that recently the top political and military leadership of Pakistan has given to Pakistan, if we had basically followed this vision 70 years ago, we would have been a South Korea or a Malaysia today. But it's good to see that our top military and political leadership do see this reality, and I think this is a good vision statement, and we hope that this vision statement will be followed as well. So just some key recommendations in the last 3-4 minutes. Reduce fiscal and current account deficits, tax all sources of income, including agriculture and real estate. Do not further burden the corporate tax sector, because this sector is bringing in jobs, taxes, foreign exchange from exports, and slowing it down by further taxing would be counterproductive. Sell all state-owned entities. Sell land owned by the government and government departments to pay off the huge debt that Pakistan has accumulated. State land should only be auctioned to pay off the debt and not be allotted to government officials, public figures. Although I do believe that the salaries of government officials are way below where they should be. The salaries should be increased, but I think this sort of a policy of giving land, I think, should be done away with. So I think if there's a lot of land and state-owned enterprises, and we need to move quickly to sell these off and reduce our debt, because God forbid if we get downgraded, there'll be no foreign buyers for our assets. I can give you the example of OGDC. In 2014, we were offered $2.25 for a share of OGDC, and the then finance minister declined that offer. Today, OGDC is selling for 48 cents. Okay, so we need to move quickly in terms of privatization so we can get a good price for our assets, because if the more we delay it, the more we're going to lose the value of these assets. Rationalize non-combat military spending, reduce the size and scope of both the federal and provincial governments and improve their competency. Ban non-essential imports of $10 billion to reduce the current account deficits is absolutely essential. If you look at our current account deficit, and where it is going right now, we do not have the reserves to back the current account deficit as well as the external debt payments. So we need to immediately ban $10 billion of non-essential imports. And Pakistani rupee should be consistently kept 10% undervalued to discourage imports and encourage exports. This is a policy that has been followed by China and Asia for the last several decades, and it has helped them grow their export base. And I think in the situation that we are, we need to follow this strategy. In terms of improved governance, we need to use the private sector to play a role. I don't have much time to go into it. We need to delegate financial and administrative powers to go to local governments. Independent and competent judiciary and investigative agencies. So I think these points are mostly covered. Accelerate economic growth rate by spending more on education and agriculture and healthcare and science and technology, ease of doing business, public-private partnerships, utilize the natural resources that we have, special economic zones with the joint venture partners, and implement policies to promote exports and import substitution and increase agriculture output. So these reforms need to be carried out immediately because we are too much into debt. Our current account deficit, our external debt servicing burden is too high. So I think there's a need for pretty much an economic emergency to implement some of these measures. Thank you so much for your time.
Now coming to my dear friend Dr. Amjad's conversation. So we have this discussion. So I'll try to give a bit of it's what he's portraying is quite factual and depressing situation. But I would like to show some ray of hope in that. In a way, if you look at the pyramid of the population in Pakistan. So 70% of the population is not representing this room. So we are minority. It's a different kind of a generation that is coming up, and the next 15, 20 years, this will be altogether a different Pakistan. And the world is changing, and this country is changing because massively because of the kind of age, population by age. So we need to realize that, we need to internalize that soon, that things are moving up. And in terms of education, health, and other indicators, where in terms of percentage of GDP, we are doing miserably bad, but that's the government spend. I mean, we have to internalize what are the private spend in that. Education is largely becoming private in Pakistan. A lower middle class even is going to a private school. So your private school fee from somewhere at 3,000 rupees per month to 60,000 rupee per month. And I'm not talking about the American schools and all that. These are the schools where lower middle class to upper middle class kids go. And that's how it is, and health is similar. And now the use of the technology to impart that education, the impact of 1 year education at the secondary level has this much of the GDP that can be implanted through private sector led solution where technology is used and education can use to the masses level. And I see this is happening. Then the university graduates, that's 1/8 or something. But many of our university graduates are half-cooked. So those boot camp private solutions are coming up. And those private solutions would lead into that. And if this country has something to do, this will do without the government. Anything where the government has involved, the things have moved back. In agriculture, he showed the example of cotton. Again, it's the intervention of but there is a silent success story in this country of a maize. I mean, maize has become bigger than the cotton in the past 20 years, and we never talk about that. This private sector-led solution where there is no involvement in government. So we need to have a similar solution in education, health, and all that. And when we talk about the exports to GDP ratio, of course, exports of goods to GDP is Pakistan is comparable to those African countries or war-led countries. I mean, but if we think about the services, that's where the future is. And we cannot be Asian like South Korea or China, they're different breed. But we are not Africans as well. Genetically, we are South Asian. And we have certain kind of, intelligence level, skill set, which needs to be harnessed, which needs to be developed. And the way the world is going up, it's not about the education in the university, it's about the specific skill set you have, and you offer that services to the world. And these things can happen, and I see private sector coming into that, and that may lead to that, and that is one thing that can drag this country out from a bias, what he's talking about. And then my question to him is about, and before my question, a comment, and I just, it's so passionate about this economic talk about, he said that we need to cut down the imports by 10 billion. Absolutely. Absolutely, we need that. The kind of current account situation, the kind of external imbalances we have, we need to do so. But what are the non-essential 10 billion imports? They are none. A poor man eats dal roti, that dal is imported. That dal is fried on ghee, that is imported. You drive the car, which is locally manufactured, 85% of that car is imported. The fuel you put in, majority of that imported. The air conditioning, lighting in this room, that fuel is majority is imported. This bottle, this is made in Pakistan, the resin put in it is imported. This paper we cannot make without the raw material which we import. So we cannot speak. It's very easy to say that to cut 10 billion non-essential imports. Where are those non-essential imports? I don't see any. We have to cut across the board. We have to cut across the board 25, 30% of consumption, whatever we are doing. That is the reality. And those are then, and now my question is how can we move and how can we cut those imports? Please.
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, I think agree with you. You see, imports, when you don't have the dollars, you see, uh, we don't have an option. So look at where Sri Lanka is today. They have run out of dollars, so they cannot import oil. So basically, they are running through 8 hours of load shedding on a daily basis. I was reading a report that there used to be 20,000 buses running in Colombo. Now there are 5,000 because there's no oil. Because of transportation problems, there is a food shortage, there is a medicine shortage, and everything else shortage. The currency has devalued by 1/3 in the last few weeks, and people are out on the street. So, if you do not manage your current account deficits in time, and you do not manage your budget deficits in time, you go towards that scenarios. So we need to cut. We simply do not have the dollars to import about $50 billion every year. What do we cut? I think everything. And basically, some things we can specially cut. For example, autos, I think you also mentioned, we are importing a lot of autos. But something is done by pricing. If you impose some regulatory duties, people will, or increase the price for oil, for example, people will start maybe becoming more careful how much they drive. So it has to be cut one way or the other. Across the board, I agree. Across the board, it can be. Oil, we import about $20 billion of oil. We need to cut maybe $2-3 billion out of that as well. How do you do that? You increase the price of oil. That's one simple way. People will start using less. So we are at a stage where there's no other option left. In terms of education, हमारी जो education की गाड़ी है, वो 4 पहियों के बजाय 1 पहिए पे चल रही है. वो आपने उस पहिए की बात की, उस टायर की बात की जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर है. 25% बच्चे प्राइवेट सेक्टर में जा रहे हैं. रफली 50% बच्चे स्कूल जा ही नहीं रहे. तो 2 टायर्स तो वैसे ही आपके फ्लैट हैं. एक वो टायर है, तीसरा जो गवर्नमेंट स्कूल में जा रहे हैं जहाँ पे एक 5वीं बात का बच्चा जो है उर्दू में सेंटेंस नहीं लिख सकता बेस्ड ऑन सर्टेन studies done by Acer and so on. The level of government schools has gone down substantially over the last few decades. So when you are running your education car on 1 tire rather than 4 tires, it will have an impact. But I agree with you that technology can play a major role in spreading education at all levels. But I disagree with you that government को छोड़ के ये हो सकता. There's a limit to basically CSR activities, limit to donations, TCF.
No.
So basically government को अपना role in terms of increasing their investment in education, healthcare करना पड़ेगा. Private sector is not a substitute of the government in any country of the world.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that that's to run by charity. The private health education, these are very thriving businesses. And I'm sure you know that. And from there are many tycoons you see they're building up on that and they're providing great service to the country. But my point is this government failure is there, and given the government failure, the way things have moved in Pakistan, the private sector has led has taken the lead, and that has moved back. So yes, the government has to do is to the governance, and yes, government has to do on something on the health and education, that goes without saying. But using the technology, using the private sector into that, where the returns, that's how the Pakistan is moving towards. And going forward, technology, the way is things is this, there's 41 million kids who are going out of the school. Now, you don't need to send to the brick and mortar schools. You don't need to invest on those teachers. You can sit in big cities, you can sit in anywhere in the world, and you can impart some kind of an education to those kids that has an immense impact on the GDP. That's what the way we need to think on that. And that's how it should be. And the time is up, and of course, I'm between you and lunch. If you people have any questions, so you can take this to at the lunchtime. And thank you so much, Amjad Saab.